Hi everybody, this is Tonks. I am at home again. I'm here for our third read aloud, and I think that finally today we will be able to finish these last two chapters. Alrighty, here we go. Chapter 17. So yesterday we left off with the German Hessian soldier came after him. I think it was some sort of cannonball exploded at them and he fell in the hole, and the Hessian soldier was dead next to him. And Nate knows that he has to get back to the fort. However, he doesn't know how he's going to basically walk through this battlefield wearing the wrong kind of uniform, knowing that they're all going to be shooting at him. So he decides that he's going to take the coat off of the dead soldier next to him, the German Hessian soldier. He puts his coat on, cuts off the bottom so it looks like it's going to fit, and he starts walking. And I believe he said he had about a mile of a walk to go, and it should only take him 15 minutes to get there. Nate moved slowly through the forest, his eyes scanning, his ears open for pounding footsteps and evil cannonball sizzles and musket ball hisses. Explosions and musket cracks filled the air, but the sky over the forts was still clear of smoke. Nate hoped that meant that the British had not made it that far. Nate passed two soldiers, both dead from musket shots. One was an American, about Papa's age. The other was a young redcoat. Nate whispered prayers as he went by each one. He kept moving. He saw no more soldiers, alive or dead. But a few minutes later, he heard voices. There, not far ahead up in the hills, 4 redcoats. Every one of Nate's muscles twitched. Run. But Nate thought of Slash, tipping his hat at the policeman as he strolled by. Remember, it was a story of an old pirate, the Slash O'Shea, and he had, I think, put on a policeman's uniform, and that way he blended in and wasn't caught. Basically wearing a disguise. Nate reminded himself he was not a terrified young boy. He was a brave Hessian. Hopefully the soldiers were far enough away so they wouldn't notice the coat's torn bottom and how it sagged off Nate's shoulders. Nate gritted his teeth. He walked along, waving stiffly like a Hessian might. To Nate's shock, the redcoats waved back. Soon they were out of sight, and Nate made it to the road. It would lead him out of the woods and right back to the fort. Nate quickened his steps. Explosions pounded his ears. Smoke burned his eyes and nose. The booms and crackles were getting louder. Just get to the fort, Nate told himself. Just get to the fort. He came to the edge of the woods. Now, just about half a mile of open field stood between him and his fort on Brooklyn Heights. The Americans had a wide-open view of anyone approaching the forts. They'd seen Nate and think he was a Hessian. They might shoot him by mistake. Nate quickly ripped off the coat and silver hat and tossed them into a bush, along with the musket and bayonet. He had taken just a few steps when he heard that nightmarish sound. Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. Nate looked slowly to his right, and what he saw in the distance turned his blood to ice. There were thousands of men, a sea of bright red spreading as far back as Nate could see. Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. Before Nate could figure out what to do, he heard pounding footsteps and panicked voices coming from the woods behind him. "They're coming! They're right behind us! Get to the fort!" Men burst out of the woods, dozens and dozens of American soldiers running for their lives. Some were bloodied. All wore wild looks of fear. Before Nate knew it, he was running too. He glanced behind him and saw some redcoats and Hessians trying to catch up. And to the right, that huge redcoat army was on the march. Their drums beat louder. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Shots rang out. Cannons boomed. Balls whizzed by. Nate tried not to imagine the blinding pain of his guts being torn open, his bones splintering, his clothes soaked with blood. Any minute, he expected a cannonball to plow through the crowd, for an explosion to blow them all into the smoky sky. Kaboom! Kaboom! Crack! Crack! Sizzle! Hiss! The sounds all melded together. The explosions, the shouts, the footsteps, the pounding of Nate's heart. It was like the night of the storm that had taken Papa, a wild swirl of terror. But Nate was not hit. And there was the fort, with hundreds of American soldiers waiting for them. Nate ran with the crowd to the back of the fort, where there was a small break in the wall. He collapsed onto the ground, but he sat there just long enough to catch his breath, and then he walked all around the fort, searching the crowd of dazed and terrified men for Paul, Martin, Captain Marsh, and the rest of the Connecticut 5th. They were nowhere to be found. Reports trickled in from the hideous battle raging outside. Hundreds of Americans had been killed and captured already. British and Hessian soldiers were getting closer to the fort. The attack would be brutal. The Americans were doomed. So what do you think the outcome's going to be for Nate? Do you think that this battle, they're going to win it? Or do you think that he's going to be captured? Hours crawled by. More and more American soldiers staggered in. Many were covered with mud from escapes through swamps. Others were soaking wet and half drowned from swimming across ponds and creeks. Some clutched arms that had been shattered by British or Hessian musket balls. Others were bleeding from the bayonet gashes. Dawn came, and still the British didn't attack. Some said they were waiting until they could sail their warships into the East River. This would let them attack from two sides and stop the Americans from trying to escape back to New York City. American soldiers stood at attention in their trenches. The cannons were loaded and ready to blast. It seemed like everyone in the fort was holding his breath, waiting. Meanwhile, all Nate could think about was the men of the Connecticut 5th. Just before dawn, the skies opened. It rained all day, soaking the men and turning the fort into a sea of mud. But Nate barely noticed the cold rain and wind. He stood outside all day, shivering and waiting. It wasn't until the late afternoon that a last group of American soldiers made it to Fort Greene. Their clothes were tattered. Their faces were caked with dirt. But there was no mistaking the man in the hideous green hat. Nate's heart leaped. Paul and the men of the Connecticut 5th had made it back. Chapter 18. 6 months later, February 2nd, 1777, 2:00 p.m. Nate walked quickly along the quiet dirt road. It was very cold, but the sun was warm on his back. He'd been traveling for 3 days. He'd journeyed first by boat, then by wagon. Now he was on foot. Very soon, his long journey would be over. Where do you think he's going? Back to the uncle's house? Or is this part of military travel? Nate's mind was filled up with memories of all that had happened to him over these past 7 months. He thought of the scared and lonely boy who had run away from Storch's house. Had that really been Nate? Somehow he'd left that boy behind, maybe in that bloody forest in Brooklyn. Oh, that terrible battle. What a disaster it had been for the Americans. The British had outmanned them, outgunned them, and outsmarted them. Hundreds of Americans had been killed. Many more had been injured and captured. It could have been far worse. The British could have captured most of the American army, including General Washington. But they kept delaying their attack on the American forts. The stormy weather kept the big British warships from laying their trap in the East River. The delay gave General Washington a chance to pull off a miracle. On the dark and foggy night of August 27th, almost 10,000 American troops snuck off Brooklyn in a fleet of small boats. They made it safely back to New York City. When the British finally attacked the forts, they found them empty. Most of the American army had managed to survive the Battle of Brooklyn, but General Washington's troubles were just beginning. Within weeks, the British had attacked New York City. By the end of November, all of Manhattan Island was in British hands. America's fight for freedom was melting away. Soldiers fled the army until there were only about 3,000 men left. The Connecticut 5th had dwindled down to just 30 men. But Paul never gave up hope, and neither did General Washington. On December 26th, the Americans launched a surprise attack on a Hessian camp in Trenton, New Jersey. A week later, the Americans battled the British in Princeton, New Jersey, and won. Those small victories put the spirit back into the American fight. Even Captain Marsh smiled a little. Nate had planned to stay with the Connecticut 5th. He'd moved with them to the American Army's winter camp in Morristown, New Jersey. But then, just 7 days ago, Nate had received a letter. It was from Mr. Marston, Storch's friend. Somehow, word must have gotten back to the Norwalk that Nate was in the Connecticut 5th. Mr. Marston had managed to track Nate down. Nothing could have prepared Nate for what that letter said. Storch was dead of smallpox. Returning American soldiers had brought the disease back to Norwalk. More than 100 people had died. But the truly shocking news came at the end of the letter. Mr. Marston explained that Storch had left no will, no letter saying what should be done with his property. You are your uncle's only living family member. Because he left no will, all of your uncle's assets go to you. Assets would mean everything that he owns. Nate read that sentence about 20 times until he fully understood what this meant for him and for Eliza and Theo. They could be free. That's why Nate was heading back to Norwalk, so he could get Eliza and Theo their freedom papers. Captain Marsh, Martin, and Paul had helped Nate plan his trip back to Norwalk. They'd hugged him goodbye, even Captain Marsh. Paul took his ugly green hat and put it onto Nate's head to bring him luck. You better come back soon, Paul had said, the flash in his eyes brighter than ever. We're going to win this fight. Nate didn't doubt it. The Americans would keep fighting for as long as it took. But for now, at least, Nate's army days were over. He'd seen enough blood. His dreams were filled with horror, of unblinking Hessian eyes, Samuel's body crumpled on the ground, the explosions of cannons and muskets. Remember, Nate is 11. It's been 7 months, maybe he's 12. And he never stopped hearing those British battle drums, that ghostly rat-tat-tat-tat. Even when he was awake, that terrible rattle echoed through his mind. Nate walked more quickly now. He could see the roof of the house in the distance. What would happen next? Eliza would have plans of her own. She'd want to find her husband, Gregory. Maybe Theo could go to school. As for Nate, he wasn't sure. Papa had been right. You never knew what life was... Papa had been right. You never knew what was ahead in life. And these past 7 months had taught Nate something else, that nothing was impossible. A group of ragtag soldiers could take on the most powerful country in the world. One man's words could lift 1,000 soldiers right up off the ground. A terrified boy could become a brave American fighter. And just ahead, the most impossibly happy sight of all, Eliza and Theo standing under the cherry tree. Nate started to run toward them. His knapsack slipped off, but he didn't stop. For the first time in months, the rat-tat-tat-tat of war faded from his mind. All Nate could hear now was Theo's voice, joyfully shouting out his name. That's it. Not exactly how I expected it to end. I don't know what I was expecting, but... It was an interesting look at the American Revolution, though, and the way that the soldiers experienced it, and especially how young some of those soldiers were. So, as a reminder, AR is available for testing at home. So I'm going to leave it up to y'all. If you feel like you have a good enough memory of this book and paid enough attention, I know it's been kind of 2 weeks since we finished it up, between when we read, but if you feel like you can do a good job on this test, then you are welcome to take a test on it on AR. I know Ava, you said you had already read this one, and I think maybe one other person, I don't remember who it was. But if you want to log into AR, the quiz number, I don't know if it's going to be backwards when I show it to you here. Is it backwards? Yeah. Okay. The quiz number is 190981. 190981. Okay. Or you can just type in, I survived the American Revolution, 1776. So if you want to take that AR test, you can. And then for our next read aloud, haven't heard anything if you guys want me to read Harry Potter or not. Let's do this. How about I will try and do... Let's try and do a Zoom video chat tomorrow at 2 o'clock. I will send a link to everybody, and if you have a device that has a camera, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a computer, and we'll see if we can do a group video chat, and that way we can all see each other and say hi, and we can talk about what book to read next, and then maybe, what day is today? Today's Tuesday, so maybe we'll do video chat tomorrow, and then I will start the next read aloud on Thursday. So for now, if you haven't logged into iStation, then why don't you go log into iStation and do a little bit of your time for today. 30 minutes is good. And then also either Imagine Math or Prodigy, 30 minutes on that. Again, hope you guys are staying safe. I miss you. I will see you hopefully tomorrow. Bye.